Silas Crow slammed his fist on the kitchen counter, so hard the tin cups rattled off their hooks and clattered across the floor. "You serve what I tell you to serve," he said, his voice low and ugly, the kind of low that meant he was done, pretending to be reasonable. He shoved the pot toward Eleanor, the one filled with yesterday's gray stew, the fat already congealed on top, like wax on a candle, the smell of it, turning even before she lifted the lid. "These men don't know the difference. And frankly, neither do you." He looked her up and down the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's deciding whether to keep or sell. "You cook what I bought, or I find somebody who will." Eleanor stood with the ladle in her hand and said nothing. "Not yet. If you have ever worked somewhere that made you feel like you were disappearing, if you have ever poured everything you had into something and watched someone else, take the credit, take the money, take everything except your name, then you already know Eleanor Briggs before I tell you a single word about her. Before we go any further, if this story moves you, if it feels like something worth holding on to, hit that subscribe button and follow along. Put out stories like this every week, frontier tales, forgotten women, lives that deserve to be remembered. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far Eleanor's story travels. Now let's go back to that kitchen. Dakota Territory, January 1888. The cold that winter was not the kind people complained about. It was the kind people survived, or didn't. It came down from Canada in walls, pressed through the gaps in every building in Holt Creek, and settled into the bones of anyone foolish enough to be outside past dark. The Rusty Spur Saloon sat at the far end of the main street, 2 stories, badly insulated, with a stove in the front room that ate wood faster than Silas Crow would pay for it, and a kitchen in the back that stayed warm, only because Eleanor Briggs kept it that way. She was 28 years old, though most people who noticed her at all would have guessed older. Hard work had a way of adding years that didn't show up in a face. So much as in the way a person carried themselves, shoulders set against the next thing. Jaw always slightly tightened, eyes that moved to the exits before they moved anywhere else. Eleanor was a large woman, solid and strong in the way that comes from years of lifting, hauling, standing on concrete floors from 4 in the morning until midnight. She kept her hair pinned back because loose hair near a fire was a death wish, and she wore an apron that had once been white and was now the color of everything she'd ever cooked. She had been working the Rusty Spur's kitchen for 3 years. She had her own room, barely. A closet off the kitchen with a cot and a nail on the wall for her coat. Silas called it part of her wages. Eleanor called it nothing, because she'd learned not to call things what they were when the man paying her was standing nearby. The kitchen was hers in every way that mattered, and none of the ways that counted. She knew every crack in the cast iron stove, knew which burner ran hot, and which one lied to her, knew how to stretch a handful of dried beans into a pot of something that made men close their eyes when they tasted it. She had learned to cook from her mother, who learned from her mother. And somewhere back along that line was a woman who understood that feeding people well was a serious thing, not decoration. Not an afterthought, but the difference between a man who could work and a man who couldn't. The miners came in every morning before first light, cold and mean and quiet in the way only hungry men are quiet. The drovers came through in waves, bringing trail dust and loud opinions. The drifters, the ones nobody asked questions about, sat in the corners and ate whatever she put in front of them, without looking up. Eleanor fed all of them, not because she loved them. Most of them never said her name. But the food mattered to her in a way she would have had difficulty explaining to anyone who asked, and nobody ever asked. Silas Crow owned the Rusty Spur the way some men owned things, not with any affection for what it was, but with a tight fist around what it produced. He was a lean man, 50 or thereabouts, with a mustache he kept groomed, and a coat that cost more than Eleanor made in a month. He had a talent for math and a complete absence of conscience, which made him well suited for the saloon business in a frontier town where nobody was keeping score except him. He walked into her kitchen twice a day. Once in the morning to tell her what to cook, once at night to make sure she hadn't wasted anything. He never said good morning. He never said the food was good, even when the dining room went quiet in that particular way. That meant every man in it was too busy eating to talk. He spoke to Eleanor in the tone of a man giving instructions to a tool not cruel exactly, not in a way anyone watching would have named. But beneath the words was always the same message. You are replaceable. You are lucky to be here, and don't you forget it. Eleanor had heard that message so many times it had started to sound like weather. Unavoidable. Just the conditions of the place. That January morning, the one that started with his fist on her counter, had begun like most others. She'd been awake since 4, fire already going, the biscuit dough already turned, by the time the sky outside showed any gray. She had a routine the way a river has a current not because she chose it each day, but because it was simply the shape of how she moved. Biscuits first, then the big pot of porridge for the miners, then whatever she had for the midday meal, depending on what supplies had come through before the storm. Except the supply wagon hadn't come. The storm had seen to that. 3 days now, without fresh delivery, and Eleanor had been working with what was left dried goods, some salt pork, cornmeal, a few root vegetables that were getting soft but weren't gone yet. She knew how to make it work. She'd been making things work her entire life. What she hadn't planned on was Silas opening the cold cellar that morning and coming out holding a crock of stews that should have been thrown out the day before. Use this, he said, setting it on the counter. Eleanor looked at it. The smell hit her before she even lifted the cloth, covering it something sour underneath the spice, the particular smell of meat that had turned the corner it shouldn't have turned. That's gone off, she said. I'll make something with the cornmeal. I've got enough.
That's good food,
Silas said, his voice still flat, not yet angry. Men in a blizzard don't need fine dining. They'll get sick. They're drovers and miners. They've eaten worse. Not in my kitchen, Eleanor said, and she said it quietly, not defiantly, not with the heat of a woman looking for a fight. She said it the way she might have said the stove runs hot on the left side, as simple fact. That was what made Silas's fist come down. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted. He was the kind who went very still and very cold, and then made a decision about how much force was necessary. He shoved the crock toward her. He said what he said about serving what he told her to serve, looking her up and down like furniture, and then he added, You think you have options here. You don't. You think any other establishment in this territory is going to hire a woman your size, looking the way you look? You cook what I put in front of you, or you sleep in the snow. He walked out. He didn't wait for her answer, because he was confident he didn't need to. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the ladle in her hand. She looked at the crock. She looked at the stove. She thought about the men who would come in from the cold. In an hour, men who never said her name. Men who handed the empty bowls back without looking at her. Men who probably didn't know she existed beyond the food. And she thought about what spoiled meat did to a body in winter, far from any doctor. She moved the crock to the far end of the counter. She reached for the cornmeal. She was not a revolutionary. She was not making a speech in her own head. She was just a woman who knew what was right about food, and she was not going to cross that line. Not for Silas Crow, not for anyone. It was the only line she still owned outright, and she was keeping it. The cornbread she made that morning was the best she'd produced in months. Came out of the cast iron pan, with a crust that crackled when you broke it, and a center that was dense and just barely sweet, the way cornbread was supposed to be when someone knew what they were doing. She added a scrape of the last good lard, a pinch of the salt she'd been rationing, and something she always added that she never told anyone about, a small spoon of the bacon drippings she kept in a sealed tin on the top shelf. Not enough to identify, just enough to make the flavor sit in the back of your mouth long after the bite was gone. She served the miners at 6 in the morning. She served the overnight card players at 7. Kept a pan warm for anyone who straggled in. Nobody said thank you. 3 men went back for seconds, which was as close to a compliment as she usually got. Silas came back at 8, looked at the empty crock of stew still sitting at the far end of the counter, and looked at her. She was already working on the midday meal. He did not fire her. He did not have anyone else, and they both knew it. But something shifted in the room, a small, almost invisible shift, like the first crack in river ice. He had told her who she was, and she had chosen not to believe him. That was new. He would need to think about how to handle that. Eleanor felt the shift too, but from the other side. She had been braced for the firing. She had stood her ground expecting consequences, and the consequences hadn't come not yet, and in that small gap between her expectation and reality, something she hadn't felt in a long time moved quietly through her chest. Not quite hope. Something earlier than hope. Something more like a door that she hadn't known was still there. She got through the rest of the morning. Midday service came and went. The wind outside picked up again in the early afternoon, rattling the kitchen window in its frame, packing new snow against the sill. The men in the front room were loud with cabin fever 3 days trapped inside. Together had made everyone rougher, the card games turning mean by the second day. Eleanor listened to the voices through the wall and kept her hands moving. It was the dead center of the afternoon. When the saloon door opened hard, not the ordinary push of someone coming in from the street, but the full-body shove of a man who was leaning on the door because he needed to. She heard it from the kitchen, heard the sudden quiet that followed, and then heard Silas's voice go up with the particular surprise of a man who wasn't expecting whatever had just walked in. She didn't go look. It wasn't her business. She was rendering down the last of the fat from the salt pork, doing it slow the way it needed to be done. It was Clem, one of the regular card players, who pushed through the kitchen door a minute later. Clem was 60 and had the face of a man who'd seen everything and stopped being impressed by most of it. But right now he looked slightly shaken. Fella just came in near frozen solid, Clem said. Silas told him to get a drink, but the man only wants food. Says he won't make it if he doesn't eat something hot right now. Clem paused. Big, Eleanor. Bigger than most, and he doesn't look like the kind of fella you tell to wait. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron. What's wrong with the stew I left on the front burner? He says he can smell it's off from across the room. Eleanor almost smiled at that. Sit him somewhere close to the stove in the front room. I'll bring something out. She had the cornbread left from the morning. There were a few pieces remaining, wrapped in cloth. She had a small pot of bean broth she'd been keeping warm for the tail end of the day. She heated both, ladled the broth into a heavy mug, and cut the cornbread generous. She put everything on a tray and carried it out herself, because Hattie, who sometimes helped with the front, was home so sick, and Eleanor wasn't going to trust a tray like that to the teenage boy Silas had sweeping floors. Came out through the swinging door and found him immediately, because there was no mistaking him in the room. He was at the table nearest the front stove, still in his coat, a heavy canvas thing, frost along the collar, a dark stain on one sleeve that might have been blood or might have been pitch. Hard to tell. He was tall, even sitting down, built the way men are built when they work outdoors in hard country every day of their lives without thinking of it as exercise. He had his hands wrapped around a tin cup of something Silas had given him, but he wasn't drinking it. He was just holding it for the heat. His face, when he looked up, was windburned and raw-boned and somewhere around 35, though the outdoor life made that hard to pin. He had dark eyes that were direct in the way that made certain people uncomfortable, not hostile, just honest in a way that didn't leave room for pretending. Eleanor set the tray on the table without ceremony. Bean broth first, she said. Drink it before the bread. Your stomach needs something warm before it can handle solid food. He looked at her, not at the food, at her. Thank you, he said. And he said it, the way people say it when they mean it, with both words taking their full weight, not thrown out fast, the way most men in that room said anything to her when they bothered to say anything at all. She left him to it. She went back to the kitchen. She told herself it was nothing a man nearly frozen, a mug of broth, and some leftover cornbread, the ordinary work of a cook doing her job. She was back at the stove when she heard his voice again, not from the front room, but from the kitchen doorway. Turned. He was standing in the frame of the swinging door, holding the empty mug and what was left of the cornbread. And he was looking at the piece of bread in his hand with an expression she didn't immediately know how to name. Not performing enjoyment, not the absent satisfaction of a man eating because he's hungry. Something quieter and more surprised than that. "I've eaten at hotels," he said. "Railroad camps. A restaurant in Bismarck that charged more than most people make in a week." He paused. "Don't know what you put in this cornbread." "Nothing unusual," Eleanor said, which was almost the truth. "Something," he said. "Whatever it is, that's not something most people know how to do." "That's—" He stopped himself, looked up from the bread to her. "Who taught you to cook like that?" Eleanor looked at him. In 3 years at the Rusty Spur, no one had asked her that question. No one had asked her any question about the food that wasn't a complaint or a request for more. She had served probably 10,000 meals in that kitchen, and the question of where the skill came from had never once come up. "My mother," she said. He nodded slowly, like that was the right answer and he'd somehow expected it. "Well," he said, "your mother gave you something real." He set the empty mug on the edge of the counter with careful respect. He reached into his coat and produced a coin, not the usual coin, not the minimum, and set ounces beside the mug. Then he looked at her one more time, and his expression was the most ordinary thing in the world. But Eleanor felt it differently than she felt most things. He wasn't looking at her size. He wasn't calculating how she fit into his day. He was just looking at her, the way you look at a person. "Name's Ronan Vale," he said. "Eleanor Briggs," she said. He nodded once, like he was filing that away somewhere important. Then he pushed back out through the swinging door, and Eleanor heard him speaking to Silas about a room for the night. The storm making travel impossible. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment after he was gone. The fat was starting to over-render. She moved it off the heat. She wiped down the counter. She did the 3 small, automatic things that filled the next 5 minutes. But inside all of that movement, something was happening that she couldn't quite name yet. Picked up the coin he'd left. It was more than the meal was worth by a lot. Not insultingly so, not charity, but enough to say that he understood the difference between what something cost and what it was actually worth. Eleanor closed her hand around it. She went back to work. Outside, the blizzard pressed down on Holt Creek with everything it had, piling snow against every door, filling every gap, trying to convince everyone inside that the world beyond these walls had stopped existing. Inside the kitchen, the stove burned steady. Eleanor's hands kept moving. And for the first time, in longer than she could honestly remember, the thought that crept into the back of her mind was not "when will this end," but something different. Something she barely let herself form all the way into words. Maybe this isn't all there is. Ronan Vale stayed 3 days. That was the thing Eleanor hadn't expected. She'd expected him to sleep off the cold, eat a proper breakfast, and move on the way men in that territory always moved on toward the next claim. The next job, the next place that needed something from them. The blizzard had other opinions. It sat on Holt Creek like a hand-pressed flat, and no one was going anywhere until it decided otherwise. The first morning after the storm, Eleanor came down at 4 as always and found the kitchen cold. The fire had gone out sometime before 3, which meant she'd banked it wrong the night before, tired and careless in a way she couldn't afford. She was crouched in front of the stove's iron door, coaxing the new fire from the last of the good kindling, when she heard the creak of the stairs from the front room. She didn't look up. She assumed it was one of the overnight drinkers finally admitting that the card game was over. It was Ronan, already in his coat, carrying an armload of firewood from the stack on the covered porch that Eleanor had never been able to lift without making 2 trips. He set it down beside the stove without saying anything, then crouched on the other side of the firebox and adjusted the damper in a way that made the flame catch faster. Eleanor looked at him. "How'd you know it needed adjusting?" Damper's a quarter turn, too closed, he said. Same thing happens in my cabin. Draft's not quite right. She didn't thank him, which would have felt strange between two people who hadn't settled yet on what kind of strangers they were to each other. He didn't seem to expect it. He stood, brushed the wood dust off his hands onto his trousers, and looked at the kitchen with the kind of direct attention that most people reserved for landscapes or problems to be solved. You start cooking at 4 every morning? He asked. 3:30 some days, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Silas know that? Silas knows the food appears. That's what he knows. Ronan looked at her then, and something moved behind his eyes, not pity, not quite. Something harder than pity and more useful. He nodded once, slowly, like he was adding something to a total he'd been keeping, then said, I'll stay out of your way, and sat at the far end of the kitchen work table with his own tin cup of water, and was so genuinely, uncomplicatedly quiet for the next hour that Eleanor forgot he was there twice, which was, in its own way, remarkable. She wasn't used to sharing the kitchen. Hattie came in sometimes during service to help carry plates, but Hattie talked constantly about her husband, about the cold, about the family she'd left in Missouri, and while Eleanor didn't mind Hattie, she minded the noise in that particular space where she needed her mind on the work. Ronan just sat. He watched her hands sometimes with the same focused, unapologetic interest he'd shown the cornbread, not watching her, but watching what she was doing, the way a craftsman watches another craftsman work. And when she moved around the kitchen, he moved his feet or shifted his chair without being asked, and that was all. By the time she pulled the biscuits from the oven at 6, she'd almost stopped, noticing the particular way her shoulders had been braced since she woke up, that permanent tightening she carried into every morning. She noticed it now, only because some of it had gone. The miners came in. Ronan moved to the front room without being told. Ruts Eleanor served breakfast alone, as she always did. The second day was harder, though not because of anything between the two of them. Silas had come into the kitchen mid-morning and found the crock of bad stew still sitting at the far end of the counter where Eleanor had left it. 2 days ago, she hadn't thrown it out because she hadn't decided yet what to do about it, whether to throw it out quietly and say nothing, or make some kind of point by leaving it where he could see she'd chosen not to use it. He saw it. You're wasting food, he said. That's not food anymore, Eleanor said. She was up to her elbows in bread dough, and she didn't stop working. That's a stomach problem waiting to happen. I'll decide what we throw out. Then decide, she said. But I won't put it in the pot. The kitchen was very quiet. She could feel him behind her, in the particular way you feel a person who is trying to decide whether to escalate. She kept her hands in the dough. Her back was straight. She had been afraid of this moment for 3 years. The moment when she pushed back, and he pushed back harder, and she still was afraid, she could feel the fear moving through her chest like cold water. But her hands didn't stop. You have some nerve, Silas said. His voice had gone thin, which was worse than when it went loud. You know what your situation is. You know what you bring to this arrangement and what I provide. You want to start renegotiating that right now, in the middle of a blizzard. When you've got nowhere to go and nobody who'd take you on? Eleanor turned the dough. She didn't answer. Look at me when I'm talking to you, he said. She looked at him. She met his eyes and held them, and what was in her face wasn't defiance exactly. It was something quieter than that, something that had decided not to perform fear anymore. She had been performing it for so long. She almost hadn't noticed that's what she was doing. She thought she was surviving. She thought that keeping her head down was the same thing as being smart. Now she looked at Silas Crow across her kitchen and understood that she had been paying a price for that performance, and it was a price that had been going up for 3 years and was going to keep going up. Say what you need to say, she told him. He stared at her for a long moment. He was clearly recalibrating a man used to a particular kind of leverage, finding it slightly less secure than it was yesterday. You're on thin ice, he said finally. Then he walked out. Eleanor turned back to the dough. Her hands were shaking slightly. She worked them through it until they stopped. It was Clem who told her, 2 hours later, that Silas had gone into the front room and made a point of telling the table of card players that the cook was getting above herself, that good help was hard to find, but ungrateful help was worse than no help, and that he'd been thinking about bringing someone up from Yankton in the spring. He'd said it casually, the way men say things they intend to be heard, and several of the players had nodded along because that was the comfortable thing to do. Clem told her this while she was loading his lunch plate, and he told her without quite looking at her, because Clem was a decent enough man, but not one who had ever taken anyone's side in anything. "You might want to be careful," Clem said. Eleanor handed him his plate. "Thank you, Clem." She went back to the stove. She already knew about thin ice. She'd been standing on it. Since she came to the Rusty Spur, she'd just been pretending it was solid ground. The only difference now was she'd decided to stop pretending. What she didn't account for was how the decision would feel. She'd expected it to feel like courage, which she associated with heat and certainty, and the dramatic clarity of a resolved moment. Instead, it felt like being cold and tired and stubborn, which was not dramatic at all, and which, she suspected, was closer to what courage actually was. Most days, in most kitchens. Ronan came back through the kitchen door that afternoon with a split piece of wood from the porch stack that had a crack running the wrong direction and would throw sparks if she used it in the stove. He'd noticed it on his way in and picked it out of the stack without being asked. "This one's bad," he said, setting it aside. "I'll split it down smaller. Use it for the fireplace in the front room instead." Eleanor looked at the wood, then at him. "You're fixing things that aren't yours to fix," she said, not as a complaint, more like an observation. "The stove's the same stove you're cooking on," he said. Seemed relevant. She almost laughed. It came up fast, and she caught it, pressed it back down. But something must have shown in her face, because Ronan's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but a slight easing around the eyes, like a man who has been waiting to see if there's anything on the other side, the locked door, and has just heard a sound from inside. He took the wood and went to the front room. Eleanor stood very still for 3 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, and then went back to work. The blizzard broke on the third morning. She knew before she looked out the window, the way people who spend time outdoors learn to know weather not by looking at it, but by the way the pressure changes, and the particular quality of the silence shifts. The wind had stopped in the night. She could hear it in the way the building had stopped creaking. She went to the small high window above the dry goods shelf and looked out at a sky that was still gray, but a different gray, the gray of something finished rather than something ongoing. By mid-morning, men were digging out. The temperature was still punishing, but the absence of wind made it survivable. And the miners and drovers who'd been trapped in the Rusty Spur for 3 days were anxious to move, most of them owing money at the camps they'd left behind, or worrying about equipment or livestock. The saloon emptied faster than it had filled, and by noon the front room held only the regular day drinkers and Clem, who didn't seem to have anywhere pressing to be. Eleanor was cleaning the kitchen, the deep clean she did when the rush was over, moving things off shelves and wiping underneath them, doing the work. Silas never noticed, because it was the kind of work that only showed when it was skipped. She was on her knees beside the stove, cleaning out the grease trap when she heard him come in. She knew his step by then, she realized. She hadn't been trying to learn it, she just had. Ronan set something on the work table. When she stood and turned, she saw his coat already on, his pack on the floor beside him, the gear of a man about to move. On the table was a small cloth-wrapped parcel. "Trail's going to be rough for a day or still," he said, "but I've got obligations. I can't push further." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron. "You heading north?" "Black Ridge," he said, "about 18 miles northeast. I've got a claim up there. Cabin, some timber I'm contracted to deliver before ice out." She nodded. She'd heard of Black Ridge, a high piece of country with good timber, good water, no neighbors within a day's ride in any direction. The kind of place that suited a man who preferred his own company. "That parcel's for you," he said. "Not the saloon." She looked at it. She didn't move toward it immediately, which he seemed to understand. Dried venison and some wild thyme I pulled last fall, he said. I carry more than I need in the winter pack. It'll keep. Eleanor picked up the parcel. She held it for a moment. Dried venison and wild thyme was not a grand gesture in the language of the frontier. It was the ordinary currency of people who lived in the country and knew what was useful. But the distinction he'd drawn, not for the saloon, for her, sat in her chest, in a place that didn't quite know what to do with it. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know it, he said. I wanted to. He picked up his pack. He looked around the kitchen one more time, the way a person looks at a place they're trying to remember correctly. Then he looked at her. When spring comes and the trail opens up properly, he said, I'll come back through. Men say a lot of things, Eleanor said. Not bitterly, just honestly. I know they do, he said. I'm telling you so you know I mean it. He went out through the kitchen door to avoid the front room, which she understood without him saying it was because he didn't want to give Silas anything to comment on. She heard the back door open and close, and then there was just the sound of the fire in the stove, and the distant voice of someone in the front room complaining about the price of whiskey. Eleanor stood in the kitchen with the parcel in her hands. She stayed that way longer than she had any practical reason to. The days after Ronan left had a quality she hadn't experienced before, which she would not have been able to describe to anyone who asked, but which felt, essentially, as like the difference between a room where something is missing and a room that had always been empty. Kitchen was the same. The routine was the same. The work was identical in every external way. But she'd become aware of the walls in a way she hadn't been aware of them before. The way you only notice how small a space is after you've had a reason to look up. She told herself it was nothing. He was a man passing through. Men passed through Holt Creek like weather. She'd seen enough of them to know that the interesting ones were almost always the ones in transit. They had not yet been ground down to the particular dull shape that staying in one place too long produced in people. Ronan Vale was interesting because he had not stayed. She should not build anything on that. She told herself this very clearly and believed most of it. February settled in with a gray permanence that made January look almost cheerful. Supplies started coming through again, on the road from Bismarck, but Silas, stung by something, Eleanor couldn't quite identify embarrassment, maybe, or the particular anger of a man who'd been looked at steadily by someone who wasn't supposed to look at him at all, had begun cutting the food budget in ways that required her to get creative in ways that were becoming frankly insulting to her skills. He was buying cheaper flour, the kind that had too much chaff ground in, that made bread that crumbled and sat heavy and tasted like effort rather than food, cut the coffee by half, and started mixing it with chicory without telling anyone, which Eleanor discovered when the miners started complaining that the coffee was off. She was the one who got the complaints. Silas didn't drink the coffee. She used what she had. She always used what she had. She was the daughter of a woman who could make something from almost nothing, and she had spent enough years in difficult kitchens to know the difference between truly having nothing to work with and simply having to think harder. Cornbread was still good. The bean soups were still good. She found ways to bring the inferior flour up closer to what it should be, using rendered fat and a longer rest before baking, adjusting things by instinct and touch. Because there was no cookbook for the particular grade of bad ingredient Silas had decided to buy, but he was watching her differently now. He came into the kitchen 3 times a day instead of 2. He stood in the doorway and watched her work without speaking, which was a different kind of management than she'd experienced from him. Before, he'd always been the kind of man who expressed control through words, through the inventory of insults he kept handy for deployment when she needed to be reminded of her situation. This watching was something else. It was the attention of a man who'd decided something and was waiting for the right moment to act on it. She noticed. She kept her hands moving and her face neutral, and she noticed. In early February, a woman named Dottie came through Holt Creek on the stage from Yankton, heading further west to meet a husband. Eleanor gathered was somewhat theoretical. Dottie was about 40, thin and weather-worn, a former cook herself who'd ended up doing laundry and rooms at a boarding house before circumstances she didn't fully describe pushed her into the stage and west. She stayed 2 nights while she waited for the next coach. The first night, Dottie ate Eleanor's food in the dining room and said nothing particular. The second morning, she came to the kitchen door and stood there, the way people stand when they want to say something and aren't sure yet how it will land. "That beef stew last night," Dottie said. "You added something sweet." "Dried apple," Eleanor said. "Very small amount, just enough to round the back of it." Dottie looked at her. "Where'd you learn that?" "My mother," Eleanor said, and felt the same small thing move through her chest that had moved when Ronan asked the same question. It was odd, the way the same words could hit the same spot twice. "Your mother knew what she was doing," Dottie said. "I spent 6 years cooking for a boarding house in Sioux Falls." "Never thought of that." She paused. "You don't belong here." Eleanor kept stirring the pot. "Where would you say I belong?" Dottie looked around the kitchen at the low ceiling, the single small window, the cracked tile behind the stove that had been cracked since Eleanor arrived and would never be fixed. "Somewhere with windows," she said. She left on the morning coach, and Eleanor never saw her again. But the conversation stayed, the way conversations do, when they say out loud something you've been thinking privately and had half convinced yourself wasn't real. Mid-February brought a cold snap that was, somehow, worse than January. The wood Silas bought for the saloon stoves was green. It burned badly, threw smoke, ate itself fast, and gave back less heat than it took. Eleanor managed the kitchen stove through sheer stubbornness, keeping the fire small and hot rather than large and wasteful, using techniques she'd learned from her mother about stacking wood for efficiency rather than just volume. The front room was a different matter. The men sat in their coats all day and complained. Silas blamed the weather. It was during this cold snap that Silas made his next move. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, she remembered, because Tuesdays were when she did the big pot of beans, always a longer process, always requiring her attention in intervals, and he stood in the middle of the room and told her that he was going to need her to sleep in the front room on the benches from now on because he'd rented her closet room to a traveling merchant who needed storage. Eleanor had been stirring the beans. She stopped. "You can't rent out a room that's part of my wage arrangement," she said. "The arrangement says I provide lodging," Silas said. "The front room is lodging. The front room is a saloon, warm, and it's a roof. You want to argue details? I can start charging you for the food you eat every day that isn't technically included in—" "Go ahead," Eleanor said, and her voice surprised her, how level it came out. "Write it down, and I'll write down my hours, and we can see how those numbers sit next to each other." Silas went very still. Eleanor turned back to the beans. Her heart was going at twice its usual rate. She could feel the blood in her ears. But her hand on the wooden spoon was steady, and she kept it moving, because if she stopped, the steadiness might leave. He didn't take her room. He didn't bring it up again. The merchant, if there had ever been a merchant, did not materialize. Eleanor understood that it had been a test, the kind of probe a man makes when he's trying to find where the edge of a person is, how far they'll allow themselves to be pushed before they break or bolt. She had told him, without speeches or tears, that the edge was here. She wasn't moving it. She understood also that he would not stop. He'd escalate in different ways, try different angles, because that was the kind of man he was, not creative exactly, but persistent in the way that men with power over other people tend to be persistent, patient with the long game, because they'd always had the advantage of time. She had no illusions about this. What she had in the days that followed was something subtler and harder to name. She began keeping track of things, not loudly, not obviously. But the agreement she'd signed with Silas when she came to the Rusty Spur, a document she'd barely read because she'd been desperate and cold and younger by 3 years, and By approximately a decade of hard knowledge, she pulled that document out of the bottom of her trunk one evening and read it properly. Every word. Twice. She was not a lawyer. She had a fifth-grade education and had read everything she could get her hands on since then, which in Holt Creek was not a large volume of material, but she could read. She could follow a sentence. And what she found in that document, when she read it the way a person reads something they actually need to understand rather than the way she'd read it the first time, was that Silas had written his obligations to her in very vague language and hers to him in very specific language. She had known this was true. She hadn't known she knew it. She folded the document back up. She put it in the trunk. She thought about it for 2 weeks, and then she did something she had never done before in her time at the Rusty Spur. She took her one afternoon a week, the Tuesday afternoon Silas theoretically allowed her, which in practice he'd been slowly eroding with requests that were hard to refuse. And she walked to the other end of Main Street to the office of the Territorial Land and Business Registrar, which was a cold little office behind the dry goods store, staffed by a man named Aldous, who was simultaneously the registrar, the postmaster, and the notary public for the Holt Creek district. Aldous looked up when she came in with the particular surprise of a man who had not expected this particular person to walk through his door. "Mrs. Briggs," he said. "Miss," she said, "I have a question about employment agreements in the territory." Aldous looked at her for a moment, then looked at the document she set on his desk, then looked back at her. "I'm not a lawyer," he said. "Neither am I," Eleanor said. "I'm just asking what the law says." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the document and read it, and Eleanor watched his face while he did, and what she saw there told her most of what she needed to know before he said a word. "You've been here 3 years?" he said. "Yes." "Under these terms?" "Yes." He set the document down. He looked uncomfortable, which was honest of him. "Miss Briggs," he said carefully, "a court would have some questions about the lodging provisions in particular. Whether a closet off the kitchen meets the definition of—" He stopped himself. "I'm genuinely not a lawyer. But I would say that if you had reason to believe this arrangement wasn't being honored as written, you would have standing to raise that." Eleanor picked up the document. She folded it twice and put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you, Aldous," she said. She walked back to the Rusty Spur in the February cold, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years, which was that the ground under her feet, though it was still frozen and treacherous, was ground she was choosing to stand on rather than ground she'd been left on. She went back to the kitchen. She started the midday meal. She did not tell Silas what she'd done. She had no plan, no clear, organized plan in the way of people who plan well. She had only the slowly hardening knowledge that she was not actually powerless. She had been performing powerlessness. So long she'd forgotten. She was Ronan Vale had not done this to her. He had not transformed her with a look or a kind word, which was a thing that happened in stories and not in real life. But he had been, she thought, the first crack in something that had needed cracking. He had looked at her and seen a person with skills and history, not an object with a function, and that small, ordinary act of human recognition had done something structural to the inside of her, something she was still figuring out but could no longer unfigure. The weeks ground on. March came in with the particular cruelty of Dakota March's warmer some days, which was somehow worse because it made you believe in spring and then pulled it back. The snow started settling into a denser, wetter form. The mud showed up at the edges of the road. The delivery wagon started making it through more liably, which meant Silas had fewer excuses for the cheap supplies, though that didn't stop him from ordering them anyway. He had begun, in the past 2 weeks, to behave in ways that were just slightly worse than before. He corrected her in front of the men, now appearing in the kitchen doorway, while the drovers were picking up their plates and pointing out things she'd done wrong. Some of which she had actually done wrong, and most of which she hadn't. He reduced her Tuesday afternoon by telling her he needed her to start the supper prep earlier on account of expecting a large party that never materialized. He docked the small amount she was paid in cash for what he called waste, and when she asked him to specify the waste, he waved his hand at the kitchen in a general way and said she knew what he meant. Kept the document from the registrar's office in the bottom of her trunk. She kept the dried venison and wild thyme from Ronan's parcel in a tin on the top shelf, using a small pinch of the thyme occasionally in dishes when she needed something that was just hers. The venison she had not touched. She was not saving it for any reason she could have articulated. She was just saving it. One night in mid-March, later than she usually stayed up, Eleanor sat on her cot in the closet room that Silas had tried to take away from her and looked at the nail on the wall where her coat hung, and she thought about a thing Dottie had said somewhere with windows. It was not a complicated desire. It was such a small, ordinary thing, a window you could see out of, that let in real light, that showed you the sky in the morning when you first woke up. She had not had that in 3 years. She had the single high window in the kitchen, which gave her gray light and the underside of the eave and nothing else. She had stopped thinking about windows as something she wanted, because wanting things she couldn't have had seemed at some point like an extravagance she couldn't afford. She thought about Black Ridge, 18 miles northeast, timber and clean running water, and a man who'd thought to pull a crack from a wood stack so her stove wouldn't throw sparks. Put out the lamp. She lay on the cot and pulled the coat over her feet because the blanket was not quite enough. It was not hope exactly. She'd been careful with hope for long enough that she knew how to hold it at a distance. There was something in the room that night that had not been there before, some small warmth that didn't come from the building, and she let herself have it. Just that small amount, and fell asleep before she could think of a reason not to. Spring came to Dakota Territory, the way it always did, not gently, not as any kind of gift, but as an argument between the cold and everything trying to push through it. The snow didn't melt so much as surrender in stages, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving the north sides locked another 3 weeks, and in between there was mud of a depth and determination that made grown men curse and lose boots. The road into Holt Creek turned into something closer to a river bottom than a road. The first cattle drives of the season came through anyway, the drovers arriving caked to the knee and in bad tempers, and the Rusty Spur filled back up with the particular noise of men who had been outside and cold and away from anything resembling civilization for too long. Eleanor cooked for all of them. She had not softened toward the work in the weeks since February. If anything, she'd drawn a cleaner line around it. This is what I do. This is how I do it. These are the terms I will not cross. And that line had become a kind of spine she hadn't known she was building, until she tried standing straight and found it there. Kitchen was still the kitchen. The stove still ran hot on the left side. Silas still came in twice a day and looked at everything she'd done with the particular expression of a man searching for something to criticize. But something in the equation had shifted enough that Eleanor could feel it, even if she couldn't have drawn a diagram of it. She was feeding 30 men some mornings now, the spring traffic swelling the dining room past its comfortable capacity, men eating in shifts, plates going back and forth through the swinging door. But Hattie was back, and actually useful for once, moving faster than her usual pace, because the tips were better when the room was full, and Hattie had a practical relationship with money that Eleanor respected. Eleanor managed the kitchen like a general, a field not elegantly, not without errors, but with the kind of hard-won competence that comes from doing the same difficult thing long enough to know where every problem lives before it shows up. The first week of April, the supply wagon came through with the spring's first delivery of fresh goods, real flour, not the gray chalky stuff Silas had been buying since February, and actual coffee, and a crate of early root vegetables from further south that weren't exciting, but were alive, which was more than could be said for what had been sitting in the cold cellar. Eleanor unloaded the wagon herself because the boy Silas employed for hauling had twisted his ankle on the muddy steps and was useless. Carried the flour sacks in 2 at a time, which was the only way to manage them. and she was on her third trip when Clem appeared on the saloon porch with his morning coffee and watched her work. Silas ought to hire somebody to help you with that, Clem said. Silas ought to do a lot of things, Eleanor said, and went back for the next sack. Clem was quiet for a moment. Then, you doing all right, Eleanor? Paused on the steps with a flour sack in each arm. She looked at him, Clem, with his old man's face, and his careful non-involvement in everything, and she could see that he was asking something real, not making conversation. Something had shifted in how the men at the Rusty Spur looked at her since February, since the day she'd held Silas's eyes and hadn't looked away. It was subtle, the way these things are always subtle, but she noticed it, the way she noticed changes in the stove's temperature, not through any dramatic signal, but through the accumulation of small differences. Men who had handed her empty plates without looking now looked, not with warmth exactly, but with something closer to acknowledgement, like she'd become a person in their peripheral vision rather than a function. "I'm fine, Clem," she said. "Thank you for asking." She took the flour inside and thought nothing more of it, until later, when the thought came back to her on its own, the way thoughts do. "When they're not quite finished," he asked. He actually asked. The second week of April brought the cattle drive that would later be talked about in Holt Creek for the muddy disaster. It was 300 head trying to cross Spring Creek when it was running 2 feet over its banks. A drover nearly drowned. 4 cattle lost to the current, the rest spending 2 days on the wrong side before the water dropped enough to try again. The surviving drovers came into the Rusty Spur in the state of men who had stopped thinking about anything beyond immediate warmth and food, and Eleanor fed them the best meal she'd managed in weeks, a proper beef stew, with the fresh vegetables and the good flour in the bread, coffee that was actually coffee, a dried apple cake she'd put together from the last of the winter's stored fruit, and a first delivery of decent sugar. The table went quiet, in that way she knew, the particular quiet. One of the drovers, a young man, barely 20, still with trail dirt in the creases of his neck, looked up from his plate and said, "This is the best food I've had since my mother's kitchen." Eleanor was walking back through with a fresh bread loaf. She heard him. She kept walking, but she held it, that small, ordinary sentence, for the rest of the evening. Turned it over while she cleaned, pressed it carefully into the part of herself that was still learning. Still slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding the understanding that she had worth not as a novelty, not as an exception, but as a woman with a particular and real skill that not everyone had, and that deserved to be acknowledged for what it was. She did not cry. She was not much of a crier, hadn't been since she was young, but she was aware, that evening, of something tender and unresolved living in her chest, and she let it be there, and that was enough. Silas noticed the full tables. He also noticed, and this was the thing that made his jaw tighten, in the way Eleanor had learned to read, that men were specifically asking if the cook would be in tomorrow, whether the kitchen was open, whether the food was the same cook as last time through. He noticed that the Rusty Spur's dining room was filling in a way it hadn't quite filled before, and the correlation between that and Eleanor's kitchen was not complicated math, but the conclusion that followed from it, that she was worth more than he was paying her, more than he'd ever acknowledged, was a conclusion he had no interest in reaching, so he did what he always did when something challenged him. He found a new angle. In the third week of April, he cut her Tuesday afternoon entirely. He said there was too much spring traffic to spare her. She said nothing, and added it to the list she was keeping in her head, the list that had started with the rotten stew, and had grown longer and more specific every week. Kept the document from the registrar's office in the bottom of her trunk. She kept her own account, in her own mind, of what she was owed. She had stopped thinking about it as preparing for a fight. She was just making sure she knew the truth of things, the way you know, the truth of a landscape you might someday need to navigate in the dark. Then the last day of April came, with muddy streets, and a wind that couldn't decide whether it was still winter or not, and Eleanor was in the middle of the morning biscuit batch when she heard the saloon door. She almost didn't think anything of it. The door opened 30, 40 times a day, but she heard Silas go quiet. Mid-sentence, he'd been talking to Hattie about something, and then she heard the particular heavy boot sound of a man who was not trying to be quiet, but who didn't need to try to be anything, because his size and his presence simply preceded him into rooms the way weather precedes a front. Eleanor stood at the work table with both hands in dough. She did not move immediately. She told herself she was being sensible. The biscuits needed turning right now, and you didn't stop biscuit dough mid-turn just because something was happening in the next room. Told herself that. She kept her hands moving. She counted to 10. Then the kitchen door swung open. Ronan Vale stood in the frame, looking essentially the same as he had in January, except that his coat was lighter now. The heavy canvas thing traded for a worn leather jacket, and there was something in his face that was less windburned and more simply weathered. Face of a man who'd been outside all winter and had made peace with it. He was carrying something wrapped in cloth against his chest, held the way you'd carry something fragile, which was odd given that he was not a man who looked like he handled fragile things. He looked at her face first, then at her hands in the dough, and his expression did the thing it had done before. Direct, honest, no performance of surprise or delight. He was simply glad she was there, and he let that show the way a person lets a fact show when they're not trying to manage how they look. "You're back," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Said I would be," he said. She turned the dough. "You're 3 months earlier than spring by some definitions. Trail opened 2 weeks ago," he said. "I've been working." He looked around the kitchen, at the biscuit tin, at the good flour she was finally using, at the coffee on the back burner, taking inventory, the way he had in January, that serious attention he paid to things. Then he set the cloth-wrapped parcel on the far end of the work table. "Those aren't for the saloon," he said. The same words as before, the same distinction. Eleanor looked at the parcel. She could see green, at the edge of the cloth, actual plant material, living the smell of it, cutting through the flour, and the coffee smell of the kitchen. She crossed to it and unwrapped the cloth, and found a bundle of wild mountain onions. Green tops, still bright, roots still damp with the soil they'd been pulled from, the kind of thing you'd only find in the high country this early in the season, and only if you knew where to look. She held one up. The green was vivid in the kitchen's gray light. "I carried them 3 days," Ronan said. "Kept them damp with creek water." Eleanor looked at the onions. She looked at him. 3 days, meaning he had pulled these specifically, packaged them specifically, thought about this specific thing for 3 days of trail walking and carried it carefully because he'd decided it was worth the trouble. Wanna, not flowers. Flowers were a gesture anyone could understand. Wild onions for a cook said something more precise than flowers. They said, "I know what you do, and I know what matters to you in the doing of it, and this is me speaking your language." "Thank you," she said. She said it the way he'd said it in January, with both words taking their full weight. He nodded. He opened his mouth to say something else, and that was when Silas Crow came through the kitchen door. He didn't knock, which he never did. He pushed the swinging door with the flat of his hand and stepped in and stopped when he saw Ronan, and the stop was not graceful. It was the stop of a man who'd walked into a room expecting one kind of situation and found another. "Vale," Silas said. He recovered fast. Eleanor had to give him that. His voice went smooth and proprietorial. Almost immediately, the voice when he was in public and needed to seem reasonable. "Back through, are you? You want a room?" "Just came to see Miss Briggs," Ronan said. He wasn't looking at Silas's. He was still looking at Eleanor, waiting for whatever he'd been about to say before the interruption. The temperature in the kitchen changed. Silas looked at Eleanor, then at Ronan, then at the bundle of wild onions on the work table, and Eleanor watched him do the calculation. It was fast. Silas was always fast with calculations, and when it was done, his face had settled into something carefully neutral that was much more dangerous than his obvious moods. "Eleanor's working," Silas said. "I can see that," Ronan said. "I'm not stopping her. The kitchen's not a social Silas, Ronan said the name quietly. No heat in it. Just the word, and the weight of the man saying it, and the implicit suggestion that he was not going to be managed. He finally turned his eyes from Eleanor to Silas, and held them there. And something happened in Silas's face, a brief, involuntary recalibration, the look of a man who has just noticed that the thing he's accustomed to leaning on is made of different material than he thought. The silence stretched 3-4 seconds. I have something to say to Miss Briggs, Ronan said. Then I'll come out front and pay for a meal if you have one going. And Silas looked at Eleanor one more time, the look that said this conversation is not over, that said you will account for this. And then he pushed back through the door. Eleanor breathed. Ronan turned back to her. He looked at the onions, then at her. He'd had something prepared. She thought some particular arrangement of words, and the interruption had broken it, and now he was reassembling. I've been thinking about something since January, he said. And I'm not a man who thinks slow, so 3 months of thinking means it's something I keep coming back to, because I haven't figured out how to say it right. Eleanor set down the onion she was still holding. She waited. I own a claim on Black Ridge, he said. 30 acres, give or take. Timber, clean water, cabin that's small but solid. I built most of it myself 3 years ago. He paused. I'm not looking for a housekeeper. I want to be clear about that. All right, Eleanor said carefully. What I'm saying is, the claim is big enough for 2 people to work, not just survive on, but actually work. I've got the timber contracts, and there's land along the creek that could grow things. Real things. If someone who knew about that kind of work wanted to try it. He stopped. He looked at her hands and then at her face. I'm asking if you'd consider coming to Black Ridge. Not as help. As a partner. Your own room, your own decisions, your share of what the place produces. Kitchen was very quiet. Through the wall, Eleanor could hear the front room, the scrape of a chair, the murmur of a card game, the ordinary sounds of the saloon that had made up the texture of her days for 3 years. She looked at him. He was not performing anything, no salesman's confidence, no romantic urgency, nothing staged. He looked like a man who had carried something carefully for 3 months and set it down and was waiting to see what happened next. You don't know me, Eleanor said. Not really. 3 days in a blizzard and a parcel of venison. That's fair, he said. I know what I saw. A woman who won't serve food she knows will harm somebody, even when it costs her. A woman who's been running this kitchen alone and doing it better than most restaurants I've eaten in, and getting treated like she should be grateful for the chance. He paused. I know enough to know that what I saw was real. The rest I'd have to learn. Eleanor looked at the onions. 3 days of trail kept damp with creek water. Silas will say I owe him, she said. I figured he would, Ronan said. Do you? She thought about the document in the bottom of her trunk. She thought about the conversation with Aldous. She thought about the rotten stew and the cut Tuesday afternoons, and the man who told her nobody else would hire her, while knowing she was the reason his dining room was full. No, she said, I don't owe him anything. He owes me. Something shifted in Ronan's face, relief, maybe a recognition. Then the only question is whether you want to, he said. She opened her mouth to answer, and the biscuits chose that moment to knead the oven. She turned automatically, moved the tray, pushed it into the heat, adjusted the damper by its familiar quarter turn. Her hands knew the motions so well she could do them without thought, and that was almost the whole problem. Wasn't it that she'd been here so long that survival had become automatic? That she'd built the competence around a situation she'd never chosen and had confused the competence with contentment? She stood with her hand on the oven door and thought about windows. I need time to think, she said. All right, Ronan said. No push, no argument. He looked at the onions. You can cook those any way you want. They're best in the last 10 minutes of a braise, if it matters. It matters, she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him, get a brief softening at the corner of his mouth, gone before it properly arrived. He pushed through the kitchen door, and she heard him settle at a front table, heard him order a meal from Hattie in a voice that carried no particular weight, just a man ordering food. Eleanor went back to the biscuits. She checked the dough she'd left. She began the midday prep with automatic, careful hands, and underneath all of it she was thinking about 30 acres and clean water and a cabin with windows. Probably because a man who noticed a cracked piece of firewood would have put windows in a cabin. She was still thinking about it when Silas came back into the kitchen an hour later. He didn't slam the counter this time. He stood in the middle of the room and crossed his arms and looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his accounting face, the one he used when he was adding something up and deciding what to do about the total up and deciding. "You've been talking to Vale," he said. "He came to see me," Eleanor said. "I didn't invite him. What did he want?" Eleanor looked at him. She weighed the truth against the consequences of the truth and decided she was tired of the weighing. "He made me an offer," she said, "to go work his claim on Black Ridge." The accounting face didn't change for a moment. Then something behind it shifted, and what replaced it was uglier, the expression of a man who's been outmaneuvered and hasn't decided yet how to respond to that. "You can't leave," he said. "You have an arrangement here. The arrangement doesn't obligate me forever," Eleanor said. "And if we're discussing what the arrangement actually says, you owe me for lodging," he said. 3 years of food and a roof. You think that comes free? I think 3 years of labor and the full cooking operation of this saloon comes to considerably more than a closet room and leftovers," Eleanor said. She said it quietly, with no particular heat. "I think if you want to sit down with the numbers, we can sit down with the numbers." Silas took one step toward her. He stopped himself. She could see him stop himself, and the stopping was interesting because it meant he'd thought about it and decided against it, which meant something had changed in his calculation simulation of what she would and wouldn't tolerate. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Vale's a drifter. He'll be gone in a season, and you'll be back out on the road with nowhere to go." "That's possibly true," Eleanor said. She picked up the bundle of wild onions and carried them to the cool shelf where they'd keep best. "But it's my mistake to make." She could feel him behind her, the energy of a man who'd run through his usual tools and found them insufficient. She went back to the cutting board. She began the midday prep with her back to him, and the act of turning her back, not in anger, not as a statement, was just as a woman resuming her work, was somehow more complete a dismissal than anything she could have said. She heard him leave. She worked through the midday service with a focus that was almost physical, something solid she could hold on to. Her hands moved through familiar motions. She plated the food and sent it out and took back the empty plates and kept the fire steady and made sure the coffee didn't burn. All the 10,000 small decisions that made a kitchen run, and underneath it all, steady as the fire itself, was the knowledge that something had changed, and she was going to have to decide what to do with it. Ronan ate his meal in the front room and paid Hattie for it, and added an amount that made Hattie come back into the kitchen and look at Eleanor, with an expression that was half question and half something else. "That fella left you this," Hattie said, and held out a folded piece of paper. Eleanor opened it. It was not a love letter, she hadn't expected one. It was a hand-drawn map, rough but accurate looking, showing the trail from Holt Creek northeast to Black Ridge, with landmarks noted in a handwriting that was large and clear and functional. Creek crossing at the split rock, trail marker at the burned pine, cabin visible from the ridge approach. At the bottom in the same handwriting, no rush. No obligation. The offer stands. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She worked through the afternoon and the evening service and the cleaning, and she didn't take the map out again. She was aware of it the way you're aware of. Something warm against your side, its particular weight, particular presence, reminding you it was there every time she moved. That evening, after the kitchen was clean and the fire was banked, and Silas had done his final count in the front room and gone upstairs without speaking to her, Eleanor went to her closet room and sat on the cot and took out the map and looked at it in the lamplight. She looked at the trail from here to there, the distance, the landmarks, the rough but legible intention of a man who'd drawn it for her as a practical thing, because he understood that what she needed was not romance but directions. She looked at the small square he'd marked as the cabin, with a tiny symbol she'd initially taken for a tree. But on closer look was a window, a small rectangle representing a window on the south wall, which was where you put a window if you knew what you were doing, to get the most light. She sat with that for a long time. Then she put the lamp out. She lay back on the cot. The buildings settled around her in the way old buildings settle. The familiar creaks and shifts she'd listened to for 3 years. The sounds of a place that had never been hers. She thought about the agreement in the bottom of her trunk. She thought about what Aldous had said, standing to raise that. She thought about Silas's face when she'd said she might leave, the particular panic underneath the contempt. He needed her more than he'd ever said. He needed her more than he'd ever paid for. She had known this for a long time, in the way you know things you're not quite ready to act on. But tonight, the knowledge had weight and shape and edges she could feel. She was not a woman who made fast decisions about large things. She believed in thinking things through, in being honest with herself about what she was afraid of and what she was willing to be afraid of and still do anyway. She was afraid. She was genuinely afraid of the unknown, of 30 acres that might be harder than they sounded, of a man she'd spoken to for a combined total of perhaps 4 hours and knew only through the evidence of his actions, which was actually more than most people gave you, but was still not certainty. She was also tired. She was tired in the deep way, not the tiredness of a long day, but the tiredness of a long situation, the weariness of spending years making herself smaller so she fit inside a life that had never been built for her. And somewhere between that tiredness and the image of a south-facing window on a cabin at Black Ridge, a decision was quietly assembling itself in the way decisions do when you finally stop trying to force them and just let the truth of things settle. She didn't make it that night. Not officially, not out loud, not in the form of words. But when she woke at 3:30 the next morning and lay for a moment in the dark before rising, she noticed that the feeling in her chest was not the usual tight brace for the day feeling. It was something else. It was the feeling of a woman who has somewhere in the night, without making a ceremony of it, started to understand what she's going to do. She got up. She put on her coat. She went to the kitchen. She built the fire. And this time, when the flame caught, she stood and watched it for a moment longer than she usually did, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to, and because she was beginning, slowly and imperfectly and without any dramatic announcement, to remember that those two things were not the same. She didn't tell Ronan her decision that morning. She didn't tell anyone. What she did was cook. She made the biscuits and the porridge and the midday stew, and she moved through the kitchen with the same hands and the same routine. But underneath it something had settled that had not been settled before, the way a door settles into its frame after you've finally planed it down to fit right. She wasn't peaceful exactly. There was too much uncertainty ahead for peace, but she was decided, and decided was something she could work with. Ronan was still at the Rusty Spur. He'd taken a room for 2 nights, which Silas had charged him full price for, with the particular satisfaction of a man who can't control everything, but can at least control what he charges. Eleanor knew Ronan was there the way she'd known it in January, through the sound of his step, the shift in the building's energy, the way certain rooms felt different when he was in them. She didn't go looking for him. She let the morning service run its course, cleaned the kitchen, started the afternoon prep, and waited for the right moment, the way you wait, for the right moment with a stove not forcing it, just staying ready. It was mid-afternoon when he came to the kitchen doorway. He didn't push through, just stood at the edge of the swinging door and looked at her with the question already in his face. "I've thought about it," Eleanor said before he could ask. And she was at the work table, cutting the last of the spring onions, his onions, the ones he'd carried 3 days, and she'd been using them carefully, a few at a time, making them last the way you make things last when they matter. She set down the knife. I want to see it first, she said. Claim the cabin. She held his eyes. I'm not saying no, but I won't say yes to something I haven't seen with my own eyes. I learned that from the last arrangement I signed without reading properly. Ronan was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's fair. When can you take me up there? Trail's solid enough now. We could go day after tomorrow, come back the same day if you want. It's a long ride, but it's manageable. I'll need to arrange for someone to cover the kitchen, Eleanor said. Hattie can manage the basics for one day. He nodded again. Then he said, You haven't told Silas yet. No. You picked up the knife again. Not until I'm ready. He accepted that without comment, which was one of the things she was beginning to understand about him, that he didn't push at the edges of her decisions, didn't try to improve on them or second-guess them. He treated her choices the way he'd treated the firewood, noticed what needed doing, did what was useful, left the rest alone. Day after tomorrow, then, he said. I'll have horses ready by 6. She nodded. He left. Eleanor turned back to the onions and kept cutting, and the decision that had assembled itself in the dark was still there, still solid, still hers. The next day was one of those days that seemed to have been arranged specifically to test her. It started ordinarily enough, the 4 o'clock fire, the biscuits, and the porridge. And then at 7 in the morning, Silas came downstairs in a worse temper than usual, smelling of the whiskey he'd been drinking the night before, and stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on, as if he'd come to announce something. I've made a decision, he said. Eleanor kept her hands moving. About what? About the kitchen situation. He came inside, let the door swing behind him. I've been too lenient. I've allowed things to slide because the winter was difficult, and I was giving you the benefit of the doubt. That's over. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket and set it on the work table beside her. New terms. Eleanor looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up immediately. She finished turning the sausage in the pan, moved it to the lower heat, and then picked up the paper and read it. It was handwritten, which meant he'd done it himself rather than having Aldous draft it, which told her something about how official it actually was. The new terms reduced her cash wages by a third, added language about food waste that gave Silas discretion to dock her pay for anything he determined to be unnecessary spoilage, and included a clause about the lodging arrangement that described her room as a courtesy rather than a contractual obligation. She read it twice. She set it down. Cutting my pay, she said. I'm adjusting it to reflect the current situation. What situation is that? The situation where I'm not sure your loyalties are with this establishment, he said. He'd recovered some of his composure overnight, had moved back from the thin-voiced anger of the previous days into something smoother and more deliberate, which was actually more difficult to deal with because it was harder to push against. I need to know the people working here are committed. This is a business arrangement, Eleanor, not a friendship. It's never been a friendship, she said, and my work hasn't changed. Your attitude has. She looked at him. You want me to be afraid of you, she said. Not accusatory, just clear. That's what this is. You want me to sign something that makes you feel like you've got a tighter grip. His jaw tightened. I want you to remember your situation. I know my situation, Eleanor said. I've known it for 3 years. The difference is I've decided to think about it clearly instead of through the lens of what you tell me about it. Push the paper back across the work table toward him. Silas looked at the paper, then at her. He picked it up. His movements were controlled in the way that meant he was making an effort to control them. You don't sign this. We're going to have a problem. We already have a problem, Eleanor said. Signing that won't fix it. It'll just make it official. He left without a further word, which was not victory. She was clear-eyed enough to know that a man like Silas Crow without a word was not a man who'd given up. It was a man who'd gone somewhere to think. She had probably 12 hours, maybe a day, before he came back with something worse. She got through the morning service. She pulled Hattie aside in the midday lull and asked her carefully, and without full explanation, if she could manage the kitchen for one day later in the week. Hattie looked at her with the sharp-eyed attention of a woman who understood more than she ever let on, and said yes, she could manage. And she said it in a tone that meant she wasn't going to ask questions. Eleanor didn't want to answer. Thank you, Hattie, Eleanor said. Hattie squeezed her arm once, brief and practical. You've been here too long, she said, and went back out to the front room. That evening, Eleanor went to the bottom of her trunk and took out the original employment agreement and the small folded piece of paper that was Ronan's map. She set them side by side on the cot in the lamplight. The agreement was 3 years old and worn at the folds. The map was 4 days old and still crisp at the edges, the ink still dark. She sat with both of them for a while. Then she packed the agreement carefully into the inside pocket of her coat, where she could reach it. She put the map on top of the dry goods tin on the shelf, where she could see it from the work table. She slept better that night than she had in weeks, which surprised her a little, given everything. The morning of the ride to Black Ridge, she was up at 3 instead of 3:30, not because she'd planned to be, but because her body had made the decision before she consciously did. She built the fire, prepped everything Hattie would need for the day's service: biscuit dough, resting, beans, soaking. The soup base already started and needing only watching, and left a note on the work table in her careful handwriting explaining where each thing was and what temperature the stove needed. She'd done more detailed prep for an absence kitchen than most cooks would have done for a full crew. Ronan was waiting with 2 horses in the gray before dawn, light, outside the saloon's back door. He'd brought a sturdy brown mare for her, calm-looking and well-muscled, built for carrying weight over rough terrain. He helped her mount without making it a thing, just offered, a hand steadied the stirrup, moved on. She hadn't been on a horse in 2 years, and it showed in the first 10 minutes until her body remembered. They rode without much talking. The trail north out of Holt Creek was muddy at the low points and solid at the high ones. The spring landscape still in that in-between state of dirty snow at the north-facing edges and mud-brown grass everywhere else, sky pale and enormous, in the way Dakota skies were enormous. The kind of sky that made a person feel small in a way that was not necessarily unpleasant. After an hour, Ronan pointed out the Split Rock Creek crossing from the map. After 2 hours, they climbed out of the valley floor, and the trail firmed up, and the air changed colder, cleaner with the smell of pine that got stronger as they went higher. Eleanor had spent most of her adult life indoors or in towns, and the smell of the high country hit her in a way she hadn't expected, like a door opening on something she hadn't known she was missing. She didn't say this. She just breathed it in and kept riding. The burned pine marking from the map was actually 2 pines, both struck years ago by lightning. Their trunks split and blackened, but still standing in the gray-white way of long-dead trees. Past them, the trail curved northeast along a ridge, and then dropped slightly into a sheltered fold of land, and there was the cabin. Eleanor pulled her horse to a stop without thinking about it. It was not large, one main room, and what she guessed was a sleeping area, built of squared logs with good chinking between them, a covered porch along the south face. There was a stone chimney, well mortared. There was, visible even from the ridge, a window on the south wall, the same window she'd studied in the map's tiny symbol, now real and actual, its oiled paper panes catching the morning light. Ronan stopped beside her. He was quiet, which was what she needed. She looked at the cabin for a long moment. She looked at the land around it, the timber on the northern slope, dense and valuable. Creek, audible before she could see it, running clear and fast over stones. Cleared area along the creek's south bank that was nothing now, but had the proportions and the sun angle of a good kitchen garden if someone put work into it. Porch faces south, she said. Gets afternoon sun from April through October, he said. I built it that way on purpose. She looked at the window. That's oiled paper. I've been meaning to get glass up from Bismarck, he said. Haven't made the trip. A pause. That'd be a priority if you were here. Eleanor looked at the whole of it one more time. She was trying to be honest with herself, The way she'd been practicing being honest with herself since February, not seeing what she wanted to see, not talking herself into or out of things based on fear or longing. She looked at the cabin and the land the way she'd look at a kitchen she was being asked to take over, practically with clear eyes, with the understanding that things that seemed solid might have problems you couldn't see from the outside. "Can I go inside?" she asked. "It's your call to make," he said. "May as well see what you'd be saying yes to." They rode down from the ridge and tied the horses at the porch post. Ronan pushed the cabin door open. It was a heavy door, better hung than she'd expected, swinging smooth on its iron hinges, and stood aside. Eleanor walked in. The main room was rough but honest. A stone fireplace on the north wall, large enough to cook in if needed. A work table along the east wall, solid pine, built at a height that was right for someone taller than average. She noticed that immediately and filed it. A set of shelves beside it, empty, waiting for things. The floor was split log, planked, and fitted close enough that there were no drafts coming up through it, which was a detail that mattered enormously in winter, and which spoke to the man who'd built it. The south wall had the window, and through it came the morning light in a clean rectangle that moved across the floor as she stood there. She looked at the light on the floor for a moment. She went to the window and looked out at the creek and the cleared ground and the slope of the land rising toward the timber. From this angle, she could see that the cleared area was bigger than she'd thought from the ridge, maybe half an acre of workable ground along the water, well sheltered from the northwest wind by the cabin itself and the line of trees behind it. "What's been grown here before?" she asked. "Nothing yet," Ronan said from the doorway. "I'm a hunter and a timber man. I don't have the first idea about gardens." Eleanor turned from the window. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the work table. She looked at the fireplace, which had a good iron hook for a pot and a raised hearth that was right. For cooking, someone had thought about that, or someone had known without thinking about it, which amounted to the same thing. "Table's too tall for me," she said. "I can cut the legs," he said immediately. She almost smiled. Not quite, she was still being careful, still taking the full measure of things, but almost. She walked to the door that led to the back room. It was smaller, a sleeping space with a wood-framed cot and pegs on the wall for hanging things. There was a small window here, too, east-facing, which meant morning light, which was a thing she had not had in 3 years. She stood in the small room for a moment. The morning light came through the east window and lay across the floor in a pale bar. She thought about the closet room at the Rusty Spur, the single nail, the cot, the ceiling, so low she couldn't quite stand straight. She thought about the way she'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a thing you've decided you can't change. She went back to the main room. Ronan was still at the doorway, still not pushing, still giving her the room she needed to think. She looked at him across the space of the cabin. "It needs work," she said. "It does," he agreed. "The chinking on the west wall has gaps. I could see light through it from inside." "I've got materials," he said. "It's a week's work." The cleared land along the creek it'd take this season, just to break it properly. "You wouldn't get a real garden until next year." "I know it." "And the road in," she said. "In a bad winter, you could be cut off for weeks." "Yes," he said. "I have been." Eleanor looked around the cabin one more time. She was doing the honest accounting, the real accounting, not the version fear would show her, and not the version wanting would show her either. The truth was somewhere between those two things, as it usually was. The truth was the cabin was solid, the land was real. The timber contracts meant income that didn't depend on one man's mood. The cleared ground was genuinely good ground for a kitchen garden, and she knew how to build a garden from nothing, because her mother had done exactly that in harder circumstances. The man at the door had spent 4 months demonstrating, in small and specific ways, that he was exactly who he appeared to be, which was rarer than it should have been. And she was 28 years old, and she had been disappearing 1 year at a time in a kitchen that wasn't hers. And she was tired in the bone-deep way that doesn't get better if you stay in the same place. All right, she said. Ronan looked at her. All right, yes? Or all right, you need more time? All right, yes, she said. Something moved in his face, not triumph. Nothing so dramatic. More like a man who'd been carrying a weight long enough that he'd forgotten he was carrying it and had just set it down. I'll have you know, Eleanor said, I'm not easy to work with. I have opinions about how a kitchen runs, and I don't back down from them. I noticed that about you, he said, and I'll need that work table cut down at least 3 inches. I'll do it tonight, he said. She nodded. She looked at the south window one more time, the light coming through it, the creek visible below, the land she was going to break her hands learning. Then she turned and walked back toward the door, back toward Ronan, back toward the next part of the conversation that still needed to happen. Now I have to go back to Holt Creek and deal with Silas, she said. The ride back down was quieter than the ride up, but differently quiet, not the cautious quiet of 2 people still figuring out what they were to each other, but the quiet of people who have settled something and are now thinking about what comes next. Eleanor spent most of it working through the practical order of things in her head. She would need her trunk. She would need to give Hattie proper instruction. She would need to have the conversation with Silas that she'd been building toward since February, and she needed to have it on her terms, which meant today. Not tomorrow, before he had more time to maneuver. They got back to Holt Creek by early afternoon, the mud on the main road catching the horses' hooves and releasing them with the sucking sound that was the defining sound of Dakota spring. Ronan took the horses around to the livery. Eleanor went in the back door of the Rusty Spur. Silas was in the front room when she came through the kitchen. She could hear him talking to someone, 2 voices, and the second one she recognized after a moment as belonging to a man named Garrett, who operated the only other eating establishment in Holt Creek, a lunch counter that served indifferent food to people who couldn't make it to the Rusty Spur. She paused in the kitchen and listened, not because she was sneaking, but because the content of the conversation made her stop. Silas was explaining to Garrett that he might have a cook available soon. Experienced. He described Eleanor's abilities with a specificity and accuracy that would have been flattering if the context weren't what it was. He was pricing her the way you price a horse you're selling, describing the product to the buyer. He hadn't told Eleanor she was being replaced. He was lining up her replacement's replacement, planning to turn her departure into a transaction he controlled. Eleanor stood in the kitchen and let that settle. She let the anger move through her cleanly, without giving it anything to catch on. Then she untied her apron, not her good apron, the one she'd worn on the ride, spare, and hung it on the nail by the stove, and she pushed through the swinging door into the front room. Silas stopped mid-sentence. Garrett looked up with the expression of a man who hadn't known a third person was in the building. I need to talk to you, Eleanor said to Silas. Now, Silas looked at Garrett, then back at her. We're in the middle of. Now, Silas, she said. Garrett excused himself with the haste of a man who was good at reading rooms. Front door closed behind him. The saloon was empty except for the 2 of them, and Silas, who had never quite dealt with Eleanor in a room where there was no one else to perform for, looked slightly less certain than usual. She reached into her coat pocket and put the employment agreement on the table between them. This arrangement is ending, she said. I'm leaving. Silas looked at the document. He looked at her. He sat back in his chair. You can't just leave, he said. You have obligations. I've read this document carefully, Eleanor said, multiple times. I've also had it read by someone else. She didn't say who, but she watched Silas's eyes go slightly uncertain, which told her that the possibility of a legal challenge was not something he'd prepared for. The lodging provision describes what you owe me. The wage provision describes what you owe me. And the term provision says nothing about a binding end date. It's a rolling arrangement, which means either party can conclude it. I'm telling you right now, you owe me for... I've worked this kitchen for 3 years, Eleanor said. Her voice was level, flat as a board, no performance in it. Alone, most of that time. I've increased the dining room's revenue. You know that's true. Because you've been charging more for meals for the past year, and the dining room's been full. I've managed your food costs. I've maintained your equipment. I've covered duties well outside what this document specifies. If you want to talk about what's owed, Silas, I'm prepared to have that conversation. I don't think you are. His jaw worked. He was running calculations. She could see it in his eyes, the numbers going, the assessment of what a fight would cost him against what letting her go would cost him. He was a man who thought in terms of loss and gain, and right now both columns were unfavorable. Got nowhere to go, he said. It was reflexive, the old line, the one he'd been using for 3 years, and even as he said it, she could see him hear that it had lost its weight. I have somewhere to go, she said. He knew she meant Ronan. His expression curdled into something between anger and contempt. You're making the worst decision of your life, he said. Vale's going to tire of you inside of a season, and you'll come crawling back here with nothing. That might be true, Eleanor said, but I'll have made the choice myself, which is more than I can say for how I ended up here. The saloon door opened. Ronan walked in. He hadn't planned to, or at least Eleanor hadn't arranged it. She'd expected to handle this alone, had been handling it alone, had been doing fine. But he was there, and the room shifted immediately with his presence the way rooms did, and Silas looked at him with the particular expression of a man whose argument has just lost its most important structural support. Silas stood. He was not a physically small man, but standing across a table from Ronan Vale, he looked it. This doesn't concern you, he said. Miss Briggs is telling you she's leaving, Ronan said. His voice was even, almost conversational, the tone of a man stating a fact. Came to carry her trunk. She owes this establishment. She owes you nothing. Something shifted in Ronan's expression, not rage. Nothing uncontrolled, but a final, complete running out of patience. He crossed the room in 3 steps, put both hands in Silas's vest, and lifted him, not slammed him, not threw him, just lifted him clean off the floor by perhaps 2 inches and held him there, so they were eye to eye. Silas's face went a color Eleanor had not seen it go before. 3 years, Ronan said very quietly. 3 years of that woman running your kitchen alone, doing work that filled your dining room every night, and you kept her here by telling her nobody else would have her. You know what that is? Silas said nothing. He was gripping Ronan's forearms, and his feet were not touching the floor. Theft, Ronan said. It's just theft with different paperwork. He set Silas back down on his feet, not roughly, but not gently either, with the particular deliberateness of a man who is controlling exactly how much force he uses. Stepped back. She's leaving. You're not going to make that difficult. Silas straightened his vest. His face had gone through several colors and was settling on a mottled, humiliated red. He looked at Eleanor, not at Ronan, because looking at Ronan right now was not something he could do. I'll tell every establishment between here and Bismarck, he said. His voice had gone thin again. I'll say you walked out without notice, caused disruption. Then I'll tell them why I left, Eleanor said. I'll tell them specifically, including the spoiled food. She held his eyes. I don't think you want that conversation traveling down the road, Silas. Not in a territory this size. He was silent. Let me get my things, Eleanor said. She went to the kitchen. She untied her good apron, the one she'd worn every day for 3 years. The one that had the particular stain along the left side from the time the beet soup had boiled over. The one that had become so much a part of the kitchen that she sometimes forgot. It was hers, and she folded it. She set it on the work table. She looked at the stove, the cracked tile behind it, the single high window with its view of the eave. She left the apron on the table. She didn't take it. She went through the kitchen door to the back hallway and to her closet room, and she opened her trunk. It was not large. Most of what she owned fit in it without trouble, which was its own kind of accounting of the past 3 years. She put in her clothes, her mother's recipe book, handwritten, water-stained, the most valuable thing she owned, the employment document, the tin from the top shelf, with the last of the wild thyme Ronan had given her in winter. She thought about the dried venison in the same tin, how she'd saved it without knowing why. She knew why now. She closed the trunk. She looked around the room one last time, the nail on the wall, the cot, the ceiling too low to stand straight under, and she felt something that surprised her. Not sadness exactly. Not relief exactly. Something that was specific to the moment of leaving a place you've endured rather than lived in, the particular recognition of what it cost you, held in the same hand as the knowledge that the cost is done. She picked up the trunk by its handles. She tried to lift it. She could move it, but not far, not fast. Ronan appeared in the hallway. He looked at the trunk, looked at her, and took it from her without ceremony, lifting it onto his shoulder with the ease of a man for whom this was genuinely not a physical challenge. Carried it out through the kitchen, and Eleanor followed him. She pushed through the swinging door into the front room for the last time. Silas was still at the table. He was sitting now, his whiskey glass in front of him, looking at something in the middle distance that wasn't anything in the room. He didn't look at her. She had the impression of a man in the middle of a revision, reconsidering, recalculating, figuring out what story he was going to tell himself and others about how this had happened. Card players who drifted in during the afternoon were at their usual table. Clem was there, and the two drovers who'd come in that morning, and the young man from the cattle drive who'd said she cooked like his mother. They were all watching. Eleanor walked through the room. She didn't look at Silas. She didn't make a speech. There was nothing she needed to say to the room, no point she needed to make for an audience. She was just a woman walking from one place to another, and the only person she needed to account to for that was herself. She was almost at the front door when Clem said quietly from his corner of the card table, "Goodbye, Eleanor." Paused. She looked at him. Old Clem with his careful non-involvement, his practiced uninvolvement in everything. He met her eyes, and his expression was something she hadn't seen from him before, something that looked, if she had to name it, like an apology in the shape of two words. "Goodbye, Clem," she said. She pushed through the front door of the Rusty Spur and stepped out into the afternoon light. The Dakota Spring was exactly what it always was, mud and cold wind, and a sky going gold at the edges, working on it, not there yet. Ronan was ahead of her. On the step, her trunk balanced easily on his shoulder, already looking up the street toward the livery where they'd need to arrange her trunk for the trail. He hadn't waited for her in the doorway, because he'd understood she didn't need him to. Eleanor stood on the porch of the Rusty Spur for a moment. The air smelled like mud and wood smoke, and somewhere underneath both of those, the particular cold, clean smell of the high country that she'd breathed for the first time that morning, and that she could still, if she paid attention, find at the back of her throat. She stepped off the porch into the street. Her boot went into the mud and sank an inch, which was undignified and inevitable and entirely beside the point. Kept walking. The mud on the main street of Holt Creek was the same mud it had always been, and Eleanor's boots sank into it with every step, and she kept walking anyway. Ronan was ahead of her by about 10 yards, her trunk on his shoulder, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who wasn't performing anything for anyone. She watched his back, and she watched the street, and she let the reality of what she'd just done settle over her the way. Cold air settles when you step outside, not gradually, but all at once, the full weight of it. She had left. She had actually left. The thought had a different texture now that it was true rather than anticipated. For weeks it had lived in her chest as possibility, as intention, as the thing she was moving toward without quite arriving at. Now it was simply fact, and facts had a different weight than possibilities, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. The fear she'd been carrying, the particular fear of what would happen if she actually did it, had no more future tense to attach itself to. It had happened. She was in it. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It was the fear of what came next, rather than the fear of the step itself. And what came next was at least something she'd chosen, which was more than she could say for most of what had come before. The livery was at the north end of the main street, and by the time she reached it, her boots were thoroughly caked, and her coat was damp at the collar from the wind that hadn't decided yet what season it belonged to. Ronan had already set the trunk down, and was talking to the liveryman, a thick-armed Norwegian named Burke, who ran a clean operation and had always been one of the few people in Holt Creek who greeted Eleanor by name when he passed the Rusty Spur. Burke was looking at the trunk and then at Eleanor as she came up, and his expression did the small recalibration of a man putting pieces together. "Miss Briggs," he said. "You heading out?" "I am," she said. He looked at Ronan. He looked back at her. A decision moved across his face and landed. "Trail north's in decent shape, above the creek crossing," he said. "You've got maybe 4 hours of good light." "We'll make it," Ronan said. Burke helped them rig the trunk to the pack horse. Ronan had arranged for the return trip the same brown mare. Eleanor had ridden that morning, steady and unbothered. She watched Burke work the straps with competent hands and thought about the ordinary decency of people who help without being asked to justify the help, who just see a thing that needs doing and do it. "Thank you, Burke," she said when it was done. "You take care of yourself up there," he said. "Good country. Hard but good." She mounted. Ronan mounted. They turned north out of the livery and onto the road that became the trail, that became, eventually, Black Ridge. Eleanor did not look back at the Rusty Spur. She had thought she might have half expected some pull, the way you look back at a place you're leaving, even when you're glad to leave it. Because the body remembers its habits even after the mind has moved on. But there was nothing pulling her back down that street, and she understood, riding out through the last mud-streaked edge of Holt Creek, that the pull had never been love for the place. It had been fear of the alternative, and the alternative was in front of her now, getting more real with every step of the horse under her. The first hour of the ride north passed mostly in silence, which was the right kind of silence, not uncomfortable, not loaded, just two people, covering ground together and letting the land do its work. The sky was enormous and going gold at the western edge. The mud of the lower trail gave way to harder ground as they climbed, and Eleanor's body remembered the riding. From that morning, loosened into it, stopped fighting the horse's movement and started going with it. Ronan rode slightly ahead when the trail was narrow, dropped back beside her when it widened. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances, which she was grateful for. Reassurances would have implied that doubt was the problem, and doubt wasn't the problem. She'd made her choice with her eyes open, and she didn't need it explained back to her. What she was doing in the silence was thinking about her mother. Her mother had been a woman of particular and unshowy competence, a woman who grew things and preserved things and cooked things and fixed things, who moved through the world with the quiet authority of someone who knew how to do what needed to be done. She had died when Eleanor was 19, too young, from a fever that came fast and didn't wait, and Eleanor had spent the 9 years since then in kitchens that were never quite her own, cooking food that was never quite hers, feeding people who never quite saw her. She had been carrying her mother's skill for 9 years like a lamp under a bushel basket, keeping it alive but keeping it hidden, afraid she understood this now, fully and honestly afraid that if she held it up and someone dismissed it, she would lose the last real thing she had. Ronan had not dismissed it. He'd looked at a piece of cornbread in a blizzard and understood, without her telling him, what it represented. Not just hunger-fed, not just a woman doing a job, something real and trained and specific, something worth recognizing. She thought about that, and about what it meant that a stranger with cold-burned hands in a frontier saloon had seen something in 4 minutes that 3 years of daily proximity had not taught Silas Crow to see. It said something about Silas, certainly, but it also said something about what she'd been willing to accept about the story she'd told herself about her own worth, and how long she'd been telling it. That was the hardest part to sit with, not what Silas had done, what she had allowed, what she'd participated in year after year, bowing her head and performing smallness because it felt safer than the alternative. She was not going to excuse herself from that accounting. She had made choices, constrained choices, fearful choices, choices with no good options, but choices nonetheless. And she was taking them with her, the same way she was taking her mother's recipe book, not as shame, as information about herself that she intended to use differently going forward. The burned pines came into view in the late afternoon light, their split trunks silver gray against the sky. Beyond them, the trail curved toward the ridge, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest as the landscape opened up that high country air again. The pine smell, particular quality of the light at elevation, where it came at you from a wider angle and hit everything a little differently than it did in the valley. They came over the ridge, and there was the cabin below, and the creek catching the last of the afternoon light, and the cleared ground along the south bank exactly as it had been that morning. But it looked different now. That morning she'd looked at it as a possibility. Now she looked at it as the place where she lived. The difference was not small. Ronan took the horses to the lean-to-shelter on the cabin's north side, a simple but weather-tight structure with a hitching rail and a water trough fed by a pipe from the creek. Eleanor carried what she could from the pack horse, her coat, her mother's book, the small tin with the time, and went inside. The cabin was cold. The fire had been out since morning. She went to the stone fireplace, found the wood box beside it stocked with split pine, and built the fire the way she built every fire from the bottom up. Small first, patient. Caught on the third try, which was not her best but not her worst either. She stood and looked around the main room. In the morning, with Ronan beside her, she'd been assessing it. Now she was alone in it for the first time, and the space had a different quality in her solitude, more specific, more real. The work table on the east wall, the empty shelves, the south window, dark now that the light had gone, but she knew what it would show her in the morning, and that knowledge was its own kind of warmth. She heard Ronan come in behind her. She heard him set the trunk down in the back room without being asked to, heard the solid sound of it meeting the floor. He came back to the main room and looked at the fire, which was building nicely now, the pine taking hold and pushing heat into the room. "I'll get more wood from the porch stack," he said. "I'll make something to eat," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "You don't have to cook tonight. There's dried meat and mine." "I want to," she said. And she said it the same way she'd told him, in the Rusty Spur kitchen. She wouldn't serve the spoiled stew as a simple fact, not a negotiation. "I want to cook in this kitchen." He went for the wood. She went to the shelves and found what he'd stored there: dried beans, salt pork, some cornmeal, a crock of lard, dried herbs she didn't recognize tied in bundles by the window. She opened her tin and took out the last of the wild thyme, found his cooking pot, a good heavy iron one, hanging on the fireplace hook, cooked by firelight, which she'd done before, but not often, and the firelight changed the way the room looked warmer, more amber, the shadows moving on the walls as the fire shifted. She made cornmeal porridge with salt pork and the thyme, simple food, the kind of food that was either done well or done badly with nothing in between. She did it well. She always did it well when she had the ingredients and the attention, and tonight she had both. Ronan came back with the wood. He stacked it. He sat in the chair by the fire, the one good chair in the room. Solid construction. The chair of a man who decided that one thing at least was going to be comfortable, and he was quiet while she cooked. The same quiet he'd had in the Rusty Spur kitchen on those January mornings, that particular quality of stillness that wasn't absence but presence. She handed him a bowl. She sat on the short stool she'd found beside the work table and ate her own portion. They ate. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the north slope in a sound that was entirely different from the wind against the Rusty Spur's walls, not threatening. Not the sound of something trying to get in, but the sounds of something passing through on its own business, indifferent and clean. "Time helped," Ronan said when his bowl was half empty. "It usually does," Eleanor said. He looked at her over the bowl. "How are you?" It was such a simple question, and it landed so directly that she had to take a moment with it. Not "how are you" as preamble, not "how are you" as social reflex, but the actual question, "How are you?" Right now, tonight, in this specific situation, you've just put yourself in. "Scared," she said, and not scared. At the same time, he nodded. like that was the right answer. Seems accurate. I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong, she said, and then I think about what was definitely going wrong where I was, and the math works out. The math works out, he said, and there was something in the way he said it quiet, a little wry that was as close to humor as she'd heard from him, and it surprised her enough that she actually smiled. Briefly and fully, the first real smile she'd had in longer than she could remember. He saw it. He didn't comment on it, but he saw it. They sat by the fire for another hour. They talked some about the timber contracts, what they paid, how the work went, about the creek, which ran high in spring and low in late summer and had never yet run dry, about what the cleared ground might grow if someone with knowledge started working it in the next few weeks. Eleanor asked questions, and Ronan answered them, and she asked more questions, and he answered those too. And somewhere in that exchange they were building something, not a romance. Not in the simple sense, but the architecture of a practical partnership between two adults who'd both been alone, long enough to know the difference between wanting company and wanting the right company. He showed her where things were kept. The oil lamp, the spare wicks, the tin of matches stored dry in the high shelf away from the hearth, the water barrel near the door filled from the creek each morning. The root cells are accessible through a hatch in the floor near the east wall, currently holding the last of his winter stores. She took it all in the way she'd taken in the first kitchen she'd ever worked in, alone memorizing the particular geography, the specific locations of things, building the internal map that would let her move through the space in the dark without thinking. At some point she realized she was tired in the ordinary way, the clean tiredness of a long physical day rather than the exhausted-to-the-bone tiredness she'd carried out of the Rusty Spur every night for 3 years. Good night. She went to the back room. She sat on the cot, her cot now, in her room now, with its east window that would show her the morning, and she took off her boots and set them beside the door and lay back. She expected to lie awake. She fell asleep in minutes. The first weeks at Black Ridge were harder than she anticipated and easier than she'd feared, which was about the ratio she'd learned to expect from things that were worth doing. The physical work was genuinely demanding. She was not soft. She'd been on her feet in a kitchen for years, but kitchen work and outdoor work used different muscles, and the first week she was sore, in places she hadn't known could be sore. Ronan worked the timber from first light, coming in for meals and then going back out, and in the time between, Eleanor worked the cleared ground along the creek. The soil was better than it looked. Dark, rich from the creek's annual flooding, with the loose, stone-free texture that meant the water had done years of work preparing it. She broke the surface with Ronan's heaviest hoe, working in rows the way her mother had taught her, and found that underneath the matted top layer the ground turned easily, willing, like a sleeping thing that just needed to be woken up. She planted what she had seeds she'd ordered through Burke at the livery before leaving Holt Creek, a modest package that represented most of the cash she'd saved over the past year, kept in a small tin at the bottom of her trunk for exactly this kind of someday. Root vegetables, because they were reliable and could be stored. Greens, because the body needed them and because she missed them. Some herbs she knew from her mother's garden, ones that would come back year after year once established. She planted in the early morning, before the heat of the day, talking to the seeds the way her mother had talked to seeds, not prayers, not magic, just the habit of a woman who believed that paying attention to things made them more likely to succeed. The chinking on the west wall took Ronan 3 days, not the week he'd estimated, because he worked efficiently and because Eleanor held the mixed mortar for him, so he didn't have to climb down and remount the ladder each time. They worked side by side without talking much, the way people work when the work itself is the conversation. She noticed that he thanked her, actually thanked her, specifically for specific things which she was not accustomed to, and which she found she was going to have to learn how to receive without deflecting. He cut the work table legs down 3 inches on a Sunday afternoon, measuring twice before each cut, checking with her after the first leg to make sure the height was right. She stood at the table with both hands flat on the surface and told him it needed to come down another half-inch. He didn't argue. He took it down the half-inch. Better? He asked. Pressed her palms flat again. Yes, she said. Glass for the windows came up from Bismarck in the second week of May, ordered through a contact Ronan had with a supply merchant who ran goods to the high country claims. Ronan installed the kitchen window himself, and when he was done, Eleanor stood in front of it and looked out at the creek and the garden and the slope of the sky above the ridge, and the light came through clean and real and actual, stood there longer than she meant to, just standing in it. Ronan came and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. Good window, he said. Good window, she agreed. The garden came up in the fourth week, the first green things pushing through the dark soil in the particular tentative way of early growth, uncertain and inevitable at the same time. Eleanor knelt beside the first row of green tops and felt something she recognized from her mother's garden, a satisfaction so specific it was almost painful. The satisfaction of having made something live in ground that was yours. She stayed kneeling for a moment. The creek ran behind her, cold and clear. Pines moved on the north slope. Cabin behind her had smoke coming from the chimney because she'd left the porridge on the low hook, and the smell of it came down to her on the wind. Wood smoke and food mixed together in the smell of a place that was inhabited. She was not happy in the simple way of stories. She was happy in the complicated way of real life, with worries underneath it and uncertainty beside it, and the full knowledge that hard things were still ahead. The growing season was short at this elevation. The winter would be longer and more isolated than she'd quite experienced. There were things about Ronan she still didn't know, and things about herself in this new context she was still learning. It was not resolved. It was not finished. It was alive, which was different from resolved and considerably better. Hattie sent a letter in the third week of May through Burke, who made the trip up to Black Ridge once a fortnight with supplies. The letter was 2 pages, Hattie's handwriting cramped and effortful, the spelling uneven but the meaning clear. She said the Rusty Spur's dining room had dropped off since Eleanor left. She said Silas had brought in a cook from Yankton who lasted 11 days before quitting, and a second one from further south who was still there, but who the men complained about in specific and consistent terms. She said Clem had been asking after Eleanor. She said she hoped Eleanor was well, and she said it in the particular way of a woman who actually meant it. Eleanor wrote back. She wrote on the paper Ronan kept for his timber contracts, with his ink and his pen, sitting at the work table that was now the right height for her hands. She told Hattie the garden was up. She told Hattie the cabin had windows now. She told Hattie she was working harder than she'd worked in years and sleeping better than she had in years, and that the ratio between those two things was different from what she'd had at the Rusty Spur, in ways that mattered more than she'd have known how to explain before she experienced them. She didn't write about Silas. There was nothing left to say about Silas Crow that was worth the ink. In June, Ronan came in from the timber work one evening and put something on the work table beside the bowl she was drying. She looked at it. It was a sprig of something small white flowers on a woody stem, the scent of it clean and slightly sweet. Wild bergamot, he said. Found a patch on the east slope. Thought you might know what to do with it. She picked it up. She did know what to do with it. It could go in a tea, or be dried for flavoring, or be used fresh in a way she was already thinking about. Thank you, she said. He was washing his hands at the basin. He looked over his shoulder at her. You don't have to thank me every time. I know, she said. I want to. He looked at her for a moment, the same look he'd had in the Rusty Spur kitchen. On the morning, she'd said, I want to cook in this kitchen, recognizing the distinction she was making, the one between obligation and choice. He turned back to the basin. Fair enough, he said. They ate dinner. The sun went down late, the way it did in June, and the light lasted long past supper time, coming in long and gold through the south window. Eleanor washed the dishes. Ronan went out to check the horses for the night. She could hear him through the open window, the horses moving, his voice talking to them in the low tone he used with animals. Not words exactly, but the sound of a person who was easy in himself and made the things around him easy too. She thought about a thing she'd noticed slowly over the past weeks. She'd been watching herself the way you watch something you're not sure is real, looking for evidence that it would change, that the patience would crack, that she'd find underneath this man the same thing she'd found underneath every other situation she'd trusted, the moment when she became less than what she'd seemed. She'd been watching for it. She hadn't found it. What she'd found instead was consistency, and consistency, she was learning, was far rarer and more valuable than any dramatic quality she could have named. He was not a perfect man. He was sometimes silent past the point of comfort, sometimes solving problems alone that he should have talked through with her, sometimes moving at a pace she found frustrating. He had a particular stubbornness about certain things, the way the wood was stacked, the route the trail took to the timber stand that she'd had to navigate around twice already. He was learning her, too, learning the ways she was difficult, and she gave him credit for learning without complaint. They were, she thought, two imperfect people trying to build something honest in hard country, and that was the actual definition of most worthwhile things. Summer moved through Black Ridge in a way Eleanor had never experienced it open and enormous, with the kind of light that lasted so long it changed your sense of time, the days feeling both longer and somehow more complete than days she'd known in enclosed spaces. The garden grew past the tentative stage into something real and productive, the root vegetables bulging the soil, the greens coming in waves, the herbs establishing themselves along the south-facing edge of the plot where the warmth collected. She began preserving in July, the work she'd always been best at, the patient work of turning abundance into something that would last through scarcity. She used the root cellar, organized it the way her mother had organized the cellar, in the house she grew up in, with a logic that made sense to hands that knew what they were looking for. Put up beans and dried herbs and pickled the first of the root vegetables, and the root cellar began to smell the way her mother's had smelled, complex and earthy and like survival taken seriously. Ronan came down through the hatch one afternoon and looked at what she'd done and stood for a long moment. "My mother kept a cellar," he said, "in Ohio. A long time ago." He looked at the rows of crocks, the hanging dried herbs, the ordered plenty of it. "Looks like that." Eleanor looked at him. It was one of the few things he'd said about where he came from, what had been there before the wilderness, and the claim and the life he'd built alone up here. Push at it. She filed it. The Ohio, the mother, the cellar that looked like this one, and let him take it back when he was ready. "Good cellars all look alike," she said. "Maybe," he said. He went back up the hatch. She heard him in the main room, heard the particular for sound of him settling into the chair by the window with his account book, the scratching of his pencil on the page. She went back to work. The first frost came in September, earlier than she'd hoped, and right when she'd expected, and they worked for 2 hard days bringing in everything the garden had left. Eleanor worked until her hands were raw, and her back was making arguments she didn't have time to address. And when it was done, the root cellar was full, and the cabin smelled like dried herbs from the bundles hanging above the work table. And she stood in the middle of it with both hands at her sides and felt something that took her a moment to name. Pride. Specific, grounded, earned pride not in herself as an idea but in her actual hands and their actual work and the actual results she could see and touch and smell. She had grown this. She had put it up. She had made something from scratch in ground that was hers, and it was enough to get 2 people through a Dakota winter. Ronan came in from the timber work and saw her standing in the middle of the room. He looked around at the hanging herbs, the organized shelves, the full cellar below their feet. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said, because she could see on his face that he was about to say something generous, and she wasn't ready for it yet. She was still in the middle of the feeling, and she wanted to stay there without it being named by someone else. He stopped. He understood immediately, which was one of the things she'd learned to count on. He hung up his coat. He washed his hands. He sat down at the table, and she put 2 cups of coffee on it, and they sat together in the cabin that smelled like a full larder and listened to the wind begin its serious business outside. There are women who spend their whole lives being told what they're worth by people who have a reason to undervalue them. Employers, circumstances, the sheer physical weight of days that never leave room to ask whether this is all there is. Eleanor Briggs had been one of those women for long enough that she'd started to believe the accounting she'd been given, started to treat someone else's low estimate as fact, the way you eventually accept any number you hear often enough. What changed was not a man, though a man was part of it. What changed was not one moment, though there were moments that mattered. What changed was the slow, unglamorous, daily work of a woman deciding to look at herself honestly at what she could do, what she deserved, at what the cage she was living in was actually made of, and finding that the bars were not iron. They were belief. Old belief deeply worn, but belief. That kind of prison is the hardest to walk out of. Not because the door is locked, but because you've been inside so long you've stopped seeing the door. Eleanor Briggs found the door. She walked through it into mud and cold wind and uncertainty, and she built something on the other side that was genuinely hers, not perfect, not easy, not the resolution of all problems, but real. A window facing south, a garden along a creek, a man who thanked her specifically for specific things, and who cut the table down to the right height without being asked twice. The territory did not give her this. She claimed it. And there is a difference, the same kind of difference she'd always known about food, between something made from nothing by someone who understood what they were doing, and something made from nothing by someone who was just trying to get through the day. The results look similar from a distance. Close up, in the eating of them, you know immediately which is which. Eleanor knew. She had always known. She just needed time and hard country, and the particular clarity that comes from. Finally, at 28 years old, deciding to trust what her own hands told her was true. The winter came down hard in October, sealing Black Ridge in the way it sealed everything in that territory, with finality and without apology. The snow came, and the wind came, and the world outside the cabin reduced itself to white and gray, and the dark line of the timber on the north slope. Inside, the fire burned, the larder held. Coffee was real coffee, and in the mornings, Eleanor stood at the south window with her cup and watched the snow move across the cleared ground where her garden had been, and thought about what she would plant first in the spring. She had a list. She added to it sometimes in the evenings, sitting at the work table while Ronan worked his accounts, writing things down in the back of her mother's recipe book, in the margins where there was space. Things she'd thought of during the summer that she hadn't had seeds for. Things she'd read about in the one agricultural pamphlet that had come up with the August supply delivery. Plans. She had plans. She had a work table at the right height, and a window facing south and ground along a creek that she'd already broken and knew would be easier next year. She had her mother's book and her mother's knowledge, and the 3 years of hard skill she'd built in someone else's kitchen, which was hers to take regardless of whose kitchen it had been. She had a man who came in cold from the timber work and said her name the way people say the names of things they are glad exist. None of it was simple. None of it was finished. It was all ongoing, all requiring daily work, all capable of going wrong in a dozen ways she'd have to figure out as they came. The frontier was not a place where things resolved. It was a place where things were built, slowly and imperfectly, and at considerable cost, by people willing to do the work. Eleanor Briggs was willing. She had always been willing. That had never been the question. The question had been whether she'd believe, long enough and firmly enough, that the thing she was building was worth building, that she was worth the building of it, that the life at the end of all that work was one she deserved to have. She believed it now. Not perfectly, not without the occasional doubt that moved through her in the small hours like cold air through a wall that needed more chinking, but enough. Most days fully enough. The snow fell on Black Ridge through the long winter, and in the cabin the fire stayed lit, and the woman who had once been invisible made herself, quietly and permanently, impossible to overlook.